I lose this job, my little boy stops breathing tonight.
The ATM receipt fluttered out of the machine like a confession. Cassie Harmon stared at it for 3 full seconds before she let it fall into the trash can bolted to the side of the kiosk. She did not need to read the number. She already knew it. $3.17. That was what stood between her and the end of everything. The evening air outside the Walgreens on Chester Avenue had gone cold the way November in Kern County always did, fast and mean, like someone had flipped a switch on the storm. She stood there in her winter coat with the broken zipper, the one she kept meaning to replace, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way the school counselor had taught her 10 years ago when she was a different person living a different life. The inhaler had run out at 7:45 that morning. She had watched Danny use the last puff of it, his small chest heaving, his lips going thin and pale at the edges, the way they always did when his lungs started to close in on themselves. He had looked up at her afterward with those dark eyes of his and said he felt fine, Mama. She had smiled and told him good. Then she had turned to the kitchen sink and gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles went white and she counted to 10 in her head. The prescription ran $287 without insurance. She had called the pharmacy at noon. The woman on the phone had been polite and said there were payment plans available. You needed $50 down to start one. Cassie had pulled out her phone in the parking lot and gone through the numbers she knew by heart. She called her mother first. The line rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which was the same as a number. Her mother had her own things, her own bills, her own small apartment in Fresno, where she had been trying to get right with herself for the last decade. Cassie did not hold it against her. She called her older sister, Renata, next. Renata lived in Sacramento with a husband who drove trucks and 2 kids in middle school and a mortgage that breathed down the back of her neck every month. The line rang 3 times. Then a text came through. Babe, so sorry, at dinner we'll call tomorrow. Cassie put the phone in her coat pocket. She stood in the parking lot and thought about what she had. She had the night shift at Ridgecrest Diner, starting at 10. She had a 6-year-old boy whose lungs could decide to close at any hour. She had a 2009 Honda Civic with a check engine light that had been on since March. She had an eviction notice taped to her apartment door since Monday morning, the kind with official county lettering at the top, telling her she had 5 days to produce $800 or vacate the premises. She had $3.17. She went inside Walgreens and walked to the pharmacy counter and asked if there was any way to get the inhaler tonight on credit. The pharmacist was a young man with tired eyes, and he looked genuinely sorry when he shook his head. Policy. She said she understood. She thanked him. She walked back out through the automatic doors and sat in her car for 4 minutes with the engine off. Then she started the car and drove to the diner to pick up Danny. Her son was staying with Eunice Garfield from 2B, while Cassie worked days. But Eunice had a doctor appointment in the morning and could not take him overnight. This had stopped being a problem in the way that real problems feel like problems. It had become part of the arithmetic of Cassie's life. Danny came to the diner with her on the late shifts. He slept in the back booth under a pile of their winter coats, and he never once complained about it. He was 6 years old, and he had never once complained about it. She found him sitting on the stoop of the apartment building with his backpack between his feet and his dinosaur blanket folded neatly on top of it. When he saw the Civic pull up, he stood and picked up both things at once, efficient and careful, like a small person who had learned early that you do not leave anything behind. Hey, buddy, she said when he climbed in. Hey, Mom. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was watching the dark street outside. His color was good. His breathing sounded normal. You feel okay, she said. I feel fine, Mama. He said it, simply not trying to reassure her, just reporting the truth. She pulled out of the lot and drove them toward Ridgecrest. The diner sat on the far edge of Highway 58, where the road straightened out and the town started to thin into scrubland and darkness. It was a low building with a red neon sign and windows that glowed amber at night, like something warm in the middle of nothing. Sam Geddes had owned it for 31 years, and he ran it with a short temper and a consistent hand and a deep suspicion of anything that cost money. He was not a bad man. He was just a man who did not look too closely at the people who worked for him, and in Cassie's experience, that was the most common kind. She pulled around back and parked beside the dumpster. Danny was already unbuckling his seatbelt. There was a ritual to it. Cassie carried his backpack inside through the service entrance. She unfolded his blanket in the large corner booth at the back of the dining room, the one nobody sat in past 9 because the overhead light had been flickering for 2 weeks. She arranged the coats into a pillow. She made him a cup of hot chocolate from the machine behind the counter and sat with him in the booth for 15 minutes while he drank it and told her about a book he had been reading at Eunice's apartment about a boy who trained a falcon. He did not mention the inhaler. She had been waiting for him to mention it all evening, braced for it the way you brace for a wave you can see coming. But he only talked about the falcon book and asked what falconers did in the winter, and she told him she did not know exactly but would try to find out. He finished his hot chocolate and lay down, and she tucked the blanket around his shoulders, and he closed his eyes. She stood at the edge of the booth and looked at him. His lashes were dark against his cheeks. He had her coloring pale and sharp, but he had his father's jaw square even at 6 years old, and sometimes when he was asleep, she could see the man he was going to become underneath the boy he still was. Marcus Harmon had been a decent-looking man. He had also been the kind of person who took $4,200 from a joint account on a Thursday afternoon and left a voicemail saying he needed to find himself. Danny had been 4 years old. Cassie turned away from the booth and walked back to the counter and put on her apron. The early hours had been quiet, the kind of midweek Tuesday that barely registered, a few truckers coming off the interstate, a couple of highway patrol guys on break, one older woman who ordered nothing but lemon meringue pie and sat with it for an hour. Cassie poured coffee and wiped tables and watched the clock the way you do when you are afraid of what the hours might bring, and also afraid of them running out. By midnight, the place had emptied to 2 truckers at the far end of the counter, nursing their mugs and not talking to each other. Cassie was in the back loading the dishwasher when she heard it. It started as a feeling more than a sound, a low vibration that moved up through the soles of her shoes and into the bones of her feet. Then it became sound, a deep resonant rumble that grew in layers, a single engine that multiplied until the windows of the diner began to tremble faintly in their frames. She came out to the counter and looked through the front glass. One motorcycle had turned off the highway into the lot. It was not the kind of motorcycle you forgot. It was a 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead, but to call it that was like calling a cathedral a building. The tank was painted the kind of black that had no reflection in it, flat and absolute, and the chrome that remained was polished to a liquid mirror finish that caught the diner's red neon sign and threw it back in fragments. The pipes were raw and loud, and they cut off together with the precision of something tuned for a very long time by someone who understood it completely. The man who swung off it moved the way big men sometimes do when they have spent their entire lives inside a body that size, not with effort, but with weight and certainty. He was past 50, built like a section of bridge cable wrapped in leather and denim, with a beard gone mostly gray and a face that had been used hard by wind and sun and whatever he had put himself through over the decades. A long white scar traced from just below his left cheekbone toward the corner of his jaw. He came through the door, and the bell above it chimed in its cheerful, oblivious way. The 2 truckers at the counter looked harder at their coffee cups. Cassie was already moving around the counter with a menu. "Booth or counter," she said. Her voice came out steady. He looked down at her. His eyes were the color of old creek water, dark and still, and they took in the diner in the way that people take in space as they are calculating exits and angles in the position of every other person in the room. "Corner booth," he said. His voice came from somewhere low in his chest, rough and measured. She led him to the booth diagonal from where Danny was sleeping and set the menu in front of him. He did not look at it. "Black coffee," he said. "Whatever meat you have back there." "Burnt." "Yes, sir." She brought his coffee first, filling the mug to within a quarter inch of the rim, the way you do for people who actually want coffee and not the performance of it. He wrapped both hands around the mug. His knuckles were scarred and his forearms were dense with faded ink. On the back of his left hand in old green tattoo script, a single word. Sophie. She did not ask about it. She clocked in his order and went back to the kitchen, and while the flat top sizzled, she checked on Danny through the pass-through window. He was still the blanket pulled to his chin, the slow rise and fall of his chest visible even from across the room. When she brought out the plate steak, cooked past any reasonable objection, and 3 eggs done to the same standard, he had placed his phone face down on the table and beside it set out with the deliberate care of someone handling something fragile, a photograph. It was bent at one corner, and the colors had the particular softness that comes from years of handling. She did not stare. She set down the plate. "Your total is $14.50, she said. He reached into the inside pocket of his leather cut and produced a fold of bills. He laid a 50 on the table. "Keep it," he said. "Sir, that is a $35 tip. I cannot." He did not look at the photograph when he answered. He looked at the booth at the back of the diner where Danny was sleeping. "Buy the kid a proper blanket," he said. "The one he has is too thin for November." She felt something move in her chest, not warmth exactly, more like the giving way of something she had been holding rigid for a long time. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." She went back to the counter and slipped the 50 into her apron pocket. Her hands were not quite steady. $35 would not fix any of the things that were broken. But it would buy Danny's medication tomorrow, the emergency dose from the urgent care on Truxton, the one that cost $32 out of pocket for a single rescue inhaler. She looked at the man in the corner booth. He was not eating yet. He was holding the photograph. His thumb moved across the surface of it in a slow, deliberate arc, the way you trace the edge of something you are afraid of losing. The motion was so personal and so unguarded that Cassie looked away immediately. She went to the back and tried not to think about Friday when the eviction notice ran out. The diner settled into the stillness that only exists at the dead center of night, after the last of the regular world has gone to bed and before the first of the morning world has started. It was in that stillness that Cassie heard the brakes. A short metallic shriek of brake pads applied too fast, followed by the low cough of a truck engine cutting out. She moved to the service window at the back of the kitchen and looked out into the parking lot. A rusted Ford F-150 had pulled in and parked illegally close to the building, angled in beside the panhead in a way that put the two vehicles within 3 feet of each other. The truck's headlights died immediately. Two men stepped out into the dark. Cassie had worked enough late shifts to understand body language in a parking lot the way other people understand words on a page. These two men were moving wrong. Their heads turned in short, rapid sweeps. One had the loose, over-controlled motion of someone whose nervous system was not entirely his own at the moment. The other moved faster and more deliberate, pulling something long from the truck bed, a wooden loading plank. The second man produced a pair of bolt cutters from inside his jacket. Her first thought was not about the motorcycle. It was not about the man in the corner booth. Her first thought was Danny. If this lot became a crime scene in the next 6 minutes, the police would come with lights and radios and clipboards, and they would ask why there was a 6-year-old child asleep in a diner booth at 1:45 in the morning. The answer was that his mother brought him here because she could not afford childcare on a night shift waitress salary, and there was no one left to call. That answer would not sound good to the kind of people whose job it was to make those determinations. Child Protective Service had a number, and it got called. She moved without deciding to move. The tire iron was kept beside the back door for breaking up winter ice on the steps. She picked it up with her right hand, and it was heavier than she remembered. She pushed through the door into the cold. The two men were at the motorcycle. The one with the bolt cutters was crouched at the front wheel examining the chain lock. The other had the plank set up against the truck bed, acting as lookout. He saw her first. "This ain't your business," he said. His voice was flat. "Go back inside. Get away from that bike," Cassie said. She was surprised by the sound of her own voice. It was not shaking. The man at the wheel stood up. He was thin in the way that is not about weight, wiry and taut and coiled, and he looked at her with the expression of someone reassessing a calculation they thought they had gotten right. She stepped forward until she was between them and the panhead, the tire iron at her side. "Do you know whose bike this is?" she said. The first man took a step toward her. His partner had gone still with the bolt cutters in his hands, watching. "Move," the first man said. "Right now." She did not move. He came at her fast, one arm extended to shove her sideways. She swung the tire iron in a short, hard arc and felt it connect with his forearm and heard the sound it made, and the sound he made immediately after a high, ragged howl of pain that tore across the quiet lot. He stumbled back, holding his arm bent double, his face a mask of shock and fury. His partner looked at the arm, looked at her, looked at the arm again. The switchblade came out of his jacket with the small metallic sound of a catch releasing. The blade caught the red neon from the diner sign and held it like a sliver of cold fire. He was inside her reach before she could complete the swing, his left hand catching her wrist, his right driving the blade down and across in a short diagonal slash. The knife caught the sleeve of her uniform and went through it, and she felt the burn of it before she felt the pain, a line of white heat from the middle of her forearm toward the elbow. She went back against the motorcycle and felt the leather of the seat against her shoulder blades, and her left hand came down instinctively onto the tank to catch herself, and the blood from the cut began to run immediately crossing the back of her hand, falling in slow drops onto the chrome and the black paint of the gas tank pooling in the curve of a surface that had been polished to a mirror finish and kept that way for reasons she would only understand later. The man raised the knife again. The glass door of the diner did not open. It exploded. The sound of it was the sound of something structural giving way a single violent concussion of tempered glass against brick, the door swinging back on its hinges with a force that sent it crashing into the exterior wall and cascading into the lot in a glittering wash of fragments. The voice that followed was not a shout. It was something lower than that and more final. "What do you think you are doing?" The man with the knife froze. Dax Boone stood into the doorway with the light behind him. He had taken off his cut inside. What was left was a black thermal, and his arms in it were visible now in their full dimensions, the forearms roped with tendon and old ink, the shoulders broad enough to block the frame of the door. His face had changed completely. The creek water's stillness was gone. What had replaced it was something older and more absolute, the recognition of a situation and the decision already made about how it was going to end. He stepped off the threshold. Glass crunched under his boots. He looked at his motorcycle. He looked at the blood on the tank. He looked at Cassie. The 3 seconds that followed were the quietest 3 seconds Cassie had ever lived through. The man with the knife was still holding it up, but his hand had lost its conviction. Dax walked forward. He did not run. He did not need to. The man thrust the blade toward the advancing figure. Dax's left hand came up and caught the man's wrist at the apex of the lunge with the unhurried accuracy of someone who has seen this particular motion a great many times. There was no struggle. There was a sound, a short, sharp report like a green branch under boot, and then the knife was on the asphalt, and the man was on his knees making a sound that was entirely involuntary. The single punch that followed was not theatrical. It was efficient. The man went down and stayed down. The partner was already in the truck. The engine turned over on the second try, and the F-150 went backward out of the lot, fishtailing briefly on the highway before its tail lights diminished and disappeared into the dark of Route 58. Dax stood over the man on the ground for a moment. His boot pressed lightly across the man's throat just enough. "If I see you in this county again," he said quietly, "they will not find enough of you to fill a shoebox." The man produced a sound of agreement that was mostly air. Dax stepped back. He turned. Cassie was still against the motorcycle. Her left arm was held across her chest, and the sleeve of her uniform was soaked through the mustard yellow, gone dark red from forearm to cuff. She was pale in the lot lights, her breath coming in short visible puffs in the cold air. She was still holding the tire iron in her right hand. She had not dropped it once. "You are bleeding on my chrome," Dax said. His voice had come down from what it had been. Rough but level, the voice of someone who has made all the necessary decisions and is now dealing with what comes after. "I am sorry," she said. The tire iron finally came down. Her knees did something she had not expected them to do. He caught her before she hit the ground. His hands were large enough that they fully encircled her forearms, and they were careful with her in a way that was not tentative, but exact, the way a person is careful with something when they understand both its fragility and its value. He set her on the step by the door. He pulled the hem of his thermal up and tore a strip from it in a single clean motion and wrapped it twice around her forearm above the cut, pulling it tight enough to matter. She made a sound she did not mean to make. "Why?" he said. He did not look up from the knot he was tying. "It is just a machine. You could have been killed over a piece of steel." She looked at the diner door or where it had been. "My son is in there," she said. He stopped tying. He looked up. He looked at the dark booth at the back of the diner, and in it, the shape of a small boy who was no longer lying down. Danny was standing at the edge of the booth. He was barefoot. He had come out from under his blanket and walked to the edge of the booth and stopped there. His face was white. His eyes were fixed on Cassie. He did not cry. He crossed the diner in 12 short steps and came through the broken doorway and the glass on the step and stopped in front of Dax and looked up at him. The man was 54 years old and 240 pounds, and he had been in places and situations that had left permanent marks on his body and his face and his history, and this 6-year-old boy looked directly up at him without flinching. "Please don't let go of her," Danny said. It was not a question. It was said the way things are said by people who have learned that the world is not generous with its stability, so you have to ask for the small pieces of it when you see them. Dax looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he looked down at Cassie, where she sat on the step. He did not let go. He called his phone out with one hand while keeping the other on Cassie's shoulder and dialed a number he knew by heart. The call lasted 12 seconds. He said a name, a location, and 2 words: "Stay put." Then he put the phone back. He lifted Cassie off the step with the same careful precision and carried her inside and set her in the first booth inside the door and told her not to move. He went to the back booth and gathered Danny's blanket and brought it back and put it over her lap. Then he went behind the counter and found the first aid kit bolted under the register and came back with it. Danny had climbed into the booth beside his mother. He was sitting close enough that his shoulder was pressed against her arm, and he was watching Dax with quiet, focused attention. Dax opened the kit. He worked on Cassie's arm without explanation, cleaning the cut with antiseptic from a foil packet, pressing gauze over it, taping it with the methodical patience of someone who has done this before under worse conditions. The cut was long but not deep enough for serious concern, and the bleeding had already slowed with the tourniquet. Cassie sat still through it. The shock was hitting her now in waves, and she was very cold and very tired. And when she looked at her own arm, she felt faintly removed from it, the way you feel when your body has outrun your understanding of events. The sirens became audible around the time Dax was finishing the tape. Danny had not moved from beside his mother, but somewhere in the middle of Dax working on the bandage, the boy had shifted his eyes to the inside pocket of the leather cut where Dax had placed the photograph before coming outside. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the tattoo on the back of Dax's left hand, the name there in old green ink. Danny looked at it with the careful attention he brought to everything that he wanted to understand. He did not ask about it yet. He filed it away. The paramedics arrived and the diner filled with people who had things to do and procedures to follow. One of them tried to separate Cassie from Danny to work on her arm, and Danny moved 2 inches closer to his mother and did not budge, and eventually the paramedic worked around it. Dax stood against the wall while they worked. When they had Cassie stabilized and were discussing transport options, she said she could not afford the ambulance. Dax said from the doorway that she pays nothing. He said it once and did not repeat it, and the paramedic wrote something on his clipboard. A younger man on a motorcycle had arrived quietly in the lot outside, sent by whatever call Dax had made earlier. He was leaning against his bike, watching the flashing lights with careful neutrality. Dax looked at him through the broken door. "Watch the bike," Dax said. The young man nodded once and did not speak. The ambulance left at 1:47 in the morning. Dax stood alone in the parking lot with the cold and the quiet and the young man watching from his bike and the lights of the diner still on inside. He looked at the gas tank of his panhead. The dried blood on it had gone black against the black paint. You could barely see it if you did not know where to look. He knew where to look. He reached into the inside pocket of his cut. He took out the photograph. He looked at it for a long time in the lot light. A young man holding an infant wrapped in a pink blanket. The young man's expression was the expression of someone who did not yet know what loss was and was holding the thing they were going to lose. He put it back. He climbed onto the panhead and sat there in the dark without starting it. One boot on the asphalt, the other on the peg, his hands resting on the tank just below the place where the blood had dried. The November wind came across the scrubland and moved through the lot, and Dax Boone sat on his motorcycle in the dark outside a diner on Highway 58 and did not start the engine for a very long time. The phone call the next morning lasted 43 seconds. Sam Geddes did not raise his voice. He said the diner had a broken front door and a police report in a parking lot that had been a crime scene, and that kind of thing was not good for a business already operating on thin margins. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say they are sorry when they mean they are done. Cassie sat on the edge of the hospital bed with her left arm bandaged from wrist to elbow and listened to him finish. The stitches under the gauze pulled slightly when she moved. There were 11 of them. She said she understood. She hung up. Danny was asleep in the chair beside the bed, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open, the dinosaur blanket from the diner folded across his lap. A nurse had found it in the ambulance and brought it in with him. He had refused to let it be moved to a shelf. She looked at her son. She looked at the ceiling. She did not cry. The thing happening inside her chest was too large and too complicated for crying. It was more like the sensation of watching a wall give way in slow motion, brick by brick, each one going and the structure holding, and then another one going and, the math on it, and the math does not improve. She had 4 days left on the eviction notice. She had no job. She had $38 in her checking account. She had Danny. She got dressed slowly, working around the bandaged arm, and woke Danny gently and told him they were going home. He came awake the way he always did, fully and quietly without complaint. He picked up the blanket and folded it under his arm and took her right hand, and they walked out of Kern Medical into the gray November morning. The Civic was still in the diner parking lot. She called a cab she could not afford. The first day back was applications. She printed 6 of them at the copy shop on Oak Street, $1.25 per page, and filled them out at the counter there with Danny sitting on a stool beside her drawing in the margins of a scratched piece of paper. Waitress positions, a cashier post at a hardware store, a part-time opening at a dry cleaning operation on Union. She dropped them off in person because she had read once that in person was better. She wore long sleeves to cover the bandage. 3 of them looked at the bandage anyway. One of them, woman managing a breakfast place on Chester, asked directly if she was going to be able to carry plates. Cassie said yes. The woman said she would be in touch. She was not in touch. The second night was Danny's breathing. She had the emergency rescue inhaler from the urgent care on Truxtun, the $32 one bought with a portion of the $50 that Dax had left on the table. It was not his regular prescription. It was a bridge, something to get through the week on. Danny's lungs had been quiet during the day, but the night brought the particular dry cold that settled over Kern County in November. And the dry cold and Danny's airways had a long-standing disagreement. She woke at 2:15 to the sound of him coughing in the next room. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious and in his doorway before the coughing completed its second round. He was sitting up, one hand on his chest, his eyes open and calm. She gave him 2 puffs from the rescue inhaler and sat on the edge of his bed with her hand on his back and felt his chest beneath her palm, working harder than it should have been. She counted his breaths, 14 per minute. Normal was somewhere between 12 and 20 for a child his size. 14 was acceptable. She knew 14 was acceptable. She sat with her hand on his back until his breathing evened and the coughing stopped and his eyes closed again. Then she sat there for another 40 minutes in the dark, listening, because 14 per minute was acceptable. But her son was 6 years old and his lungs were not reliable, and the nearest emergency room was 3 miles away, and the bill from Kern Medical for the stitches had not yet arrived in the mail, but she knew what it was going to say when it did. She did not call 911. She could not afford what came after 911. This was the calculation she made in the dark of her son's room at 3 in the morning, and she was clear-eyed about it in the way that people who have been making impossible calculations for a long time become clear-eyed about them. It was not resignation. It was arithmetic. By the time his breathing settled fully, it was nearly 4 in the morning, and the cold had come into the apartment because the heat ran on a timer she had set to cut off at midnight to save on the gas bill. She went to the hall closet and got her own coat and came back and laid it across Danny's blanket and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed until it was light. The third day was the county office. The Family Resource Center on Flower Street had a waiting room with plastic chairs in a color that might once have been green. Cassie took a number and sat for 2 hours and 15 minutes and watched the room empty and refill around her. Danny had a library book in his lap about birds of prey, and he read it with the focused attention he brought to everything and asked her once if she wanted him to explain about the wing structure of a red-tailed hawk, and she said, "Yes, please." He explained it carefully and completely. When her number was called, the caseworker was a thin man in his late 30s named Patterson, who had the expression of someone who had been delivering the same news to different people for long enough that the news and the person delivering it had become the same thing. He listened to her situation. He typed things. He told her the emergency housing assistance waitlist was currently at 19 days minimum. He told her about the supplemental nutrition program. He told her about the winter utility assistance program. She asked about anything faster than 19 days. He said there was nothing faster than 19 days. She thanked him. She got up. She took Danny by the hand. Outside on Flower Street, the November sky was the color of old concrete. Danny looked up at it and then at her. "Are we going to be okay?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "We are going to be okay." She said it the way you say the true things when you are not yet certain they are true, but you know they need to be said aloud to someone who is counting on them. Danny nodded once as if she had confirmed something he had already reasoned through on his own. The fourth morning was Delano. She was up at 6:15. Danny was still asleep. She dressed quietly and went to the kitchen and looked at what was left in the cabinets. A can of soup, half a box of pasta, a jar of peanut butter getting close to the end. She made him toast with peanut butter and sliced the last apple in the refrigerator into 8 pieces and set it all at his place at the table. She made herself coffee. She had been thinking about the Delano Community Health Clinic since the second night. She had heard about it 2 years ago from another waitress at Ridgecrest, a woman named Doreen, who had a nephew with asthma and no insurance. The clinic operated on a sliding scale fee, no insurance required. They had a pediatric pulmonary specialist who came in on Wednesdays. Today was Wednesday. She had no appointment. She also had no working phone number for them because the listing had changed twice in 2 years, and the number she had written down connected to a recording saying it was no longer in service. She had tried it on the second night, sitting on the bathroom floor after Danny fell asleep, so he would not hear her on the phone. So she was going in person. She wrote a note for Danny and left it on the table beside his plate, telling him she had gone to get him an appointment with a new doctor and would be back before 9. She slipped a note under Eunice's door at 6:30 asking her to listen for him. The drive to Delano was 42 minutes on Highway 99 South. She drove it in the gray early morning with the heater on low because the temperature gauge on the Civic climbed it when she ran it on high, and she could not afford to find out what was wrong with the temperature gauge right now. The Delano Community Health Clinic was on Garces Highway, a low beige building with a small parking lot and a sign listing its services. She pulled in at 7:52. The lights were on inside. There was already a line, 6 people ahead of her. Cassie got in line. At 8, when the doors opened, she moved forward with the line, and at 8:22, she was at the front desk explaining her situation to a woman named Darlene, who had reading glasses on a beaded chain and who listened without interrupting. Cassie said she had a 6-year-old with chronic severe asthma, no current insurance, no primary care physician, since their previous doctor left the practice 8 months ago, a rescue inhaler that was not a long-term solution, and no appointment. Darlene looked at her over the reading glasses. She looked at the bandaged arm. "You drive down from Bakersfield this morning," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Darlene wrote something on a small form and slid it across the desk. "Fill this out. Dr. Abrams has a cancellation at 10:40, pediatric pulmonary intake. You will need to bring your son for the actual appointment. Today is just to get you on the schedule and start the paperwork." Cassie looked at the form. She looked at Darlene. "Thank you," she said. She meant it in a way that was hard to fit inside 2 words. She filled out the form standing at the counter with precise small handwriting and did not leave any fields blank. She drove back to Bakersfield with the appointment card in her coat pocket. Danny's appointment was the following Wednesday at 10:40 in the morning. She did not know where they were going to sleep on Tuesday night, but Danny had a doctor's appointment. She held on to that the way you hold on to a thing when there is not much else to hold on to. On the 4th afternoon at 3:30, there was a knock at the apartment door. She was in the middle of packing, wrapping the few plates and cups and newspapers saved from the recycling bin, placing them in boxes gotten free from behind the grocery store on Ming. Danny was in his room methodically filling his backpack with the things he considered essential. She opened the door. Willa Shepard from 1C was standing in the hallway. Willa Shepard was 72 years old and had lived in the building for 11 years, which was longer than anyone else currently in residence. She was a small woman from Tuscaloosa, originally with white hair she kept in a bun, and a way of standing that suggested she had once been taller and had not entirely accepted the renegotiation. She brought things. It was her primary mode of expression. She was holding a casserole dish. I heard about what happened at the diner, Willa said. I heard about the job. Cassie leaned against the doorframe. Willa held out the casserole. Chicken and rice, still warm. Cassie took it with her good arm. Willa did not leave. She said a man came to see you yesterday morning. Big man, leather jacket. He knocked on your door around 9, and when there was no answer, he came downstairs and knocked on mine. Cassie went still. He asked me about Danny, Willa said. Asked whether the boy had bad breathing spells at night. Asked how many shifts you worked in a week. She paused. He listened very carefully when I answered. The kind of careful that means he was going to remember what I said. Cassie looked at the casserole dish in her hands. He did not leave a name, Willa said, but he sat in his car in the lot for about 20 minutes after. I watched from the window. He did not drive away until he had looked up at your apartment for a good long while. After Willa went back downstairs, Cassie stood in the kitchen with the casserole dish still in her hands and thought about that. She had been certain somewhere around the second day that she was a specific moment in a specific parking lot that had no continuation. She had thought about Dax Boone the way you think about people who appear in the middle of a crisis and then return to their own lives because their lives were happening somewhere else and the crisis was yours alone. She had thought she was alone in this. The information that she was not alone in this arrived in her chest in a complicated way she did not have words for immediately. It was not relief. It was something more fragile than relief, something she was afraid to put weight on yet. She put the casserole on the stove and went back to packing. The fifth morning was the last morning. The eviction notice had said 8 a.m. It was 7:45 now. She had 2 suitcases and 3 boxes stacked near the door. The apartment was bare in the way that rental apartments become bare at the end of a tenancy, the walls showing the ghost rectangles where pictures had been the carpet, showing the indentations where furniture had stood. Danny was sitting on one of the boxes. He was not reading. He was not drawing. He was just sitting with his backpack on, looking at the wall across from him with an expression that was composed and patient and old, in a way that Cassie could not look at directly for more than a few seconds at a time. She had $38. She had 2 suitcases. She had a doctor's appointment card in her coat pocket for a Wednesday 5 days away. She had a boy sitting on a cardboard box who was not crying. She went to the window and looked down at the lot. Then the floor began to vibrate. It started below the threshold of sound, a low frequency she felt in the soles of her feet before she heard anything. Then it became audible, a deep bass note that rose steadily from 1 engine to 2 to something that was no longer countable as individual sources. The windows trembled in their frames. Danny slid off the box. He came and stood beside her. He looked down through the glass at the parking lot of the apartment complex on Oleander Avenue in Bakersfield, California on a Saturday morning in November, and his mouth opened slightly. 30 motorcycles. They came in from the street 2 by 2, filling the cracked asphalt of the lot in a diagonal line that stretched from the entrance to the far wall, engines running. Black leather, faded denim, the winged death's head reproduced across 30 backs, the top rockers reading Hell's Angels, the bottom rockers reading California. The sound of them together was not loud the way traffic is loud. It was the kind of sound that occupied a space completely and left no room for anything else. People in the building were pulling their curtains. A man from the 3rd floor opened his door, looked down the exterior walkway, and closed his door again. Danny stood at the window and looked down at 30 motorcycles and the men who rode them, and he did not look afraid. He looked at Cassie. His voice was not uncertain. It was the voice of someone making a statement of fact arrived at through direct observation. "Mom," he said, "they came for us." Cassie had no answer for that. She put her hand on his shoulder. A knock at the door came 2 minutes later. Dax Boone stood in the hallway. He had on the same leather cut, the same engineer boots. He had taken his sunglasses off and was holding them at his side. He looked at the stacked boxes behind her. He looked at the bare walls. He looked at Danny standing in the middle of the empty room with his backpack on. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his cut and produced a manila envelope. He held it out. She took it. She opened the clasp. Inside were 3 items. The first was a cashier's check made out to Kern Medical Center with a number on it that covered her ER visit, in the stitches in the ambulance charge that had arrived in the mail on the third day. The second was a lease agreement for a two-bedroom townhouse on the north side of Bakersfield in a neighborhood with sidewalks in a school within walking distance. The lease was prepaid for 2 years. Her name was already on it. The third item was a folded piece of paper smaller than the others. She opened it. It was handwritten in a script that was not refined but was deliberate, the writing of someone who chose words carefully because they were not in the habit of using many. It said Sophie would have been 31 this November. That was all. Cassie looked at the paper. "I cannot take this," she said. Her voice came out without enough air behind it. "This is tens of thousands of dollars. I do not know how to." She stopped. She looked at him. "Why," she said. Dax stepped into the apartment. He stood in the empty room with the ghost rectangles on the walls and the indentations in the carpet, and he looked at the envelope in her hands. Then he reached into his pocket again. He took out the photograph. He set it on the mantel of the unused electric fireplace beside the door. He did not hold it this time. He just set it down and stepped back, and for the first time Cassie could see it fully, the young man in it, and the infant wrapped in a pink blanket, and the expression on the face of the young man, which was the expression of someone who did not yet know what loss was and was holding the thing they were going to lose. Her name was Sophie, Dax said. His voice was level. It had the quality of something rehearsed, not because he was performing it, but because the only way to say certain things out loud, that is to have said them in your head many times first building a road to them. 30 years ago, I was nobody, he said. A kid with grease under my nails doing body work at a shop in Fresno. I had $20 in my wallet most days and a motorcycle I was still paying off. Sophie had lungs like Danny, bad from the start. He looked at the photograph on the mantel. She had a bad spell one February, he said. We waited too long to take her to the ER. He stopped. His jaw moved once a small, controlled motion. I waited too long. I was looking at the numbers, trying to figure out which bill we could hold off on and whether the urgent care was going to be enough, or whether we needed the full ER and what the difference was going to cost. He looked at Cassie. We got there and they took her back, and I sat in the waiting room, he said. I picked up a magazine off the table, a used car classified ad, the free kind they have in a bin at the entrance. I sat there and I read it because I did not know what else to do with my hands. I read listings for cars I could not afford and would never buy while my daughter was dying in a room 10 feet away from me. The room was very quiet. When the nurse came out, he said the magazine was still in my hands. I looked at it on the way to the floor. I never forgot that. The specific magazine. What was on the cover? He looked at Cassie directly. I have been in this club for 28 years, he said. I have done things I would not undo and things I would. I have buried brothers. I have ridden through things that would make most men quit. He paused. Nothing has ever looked like that waiting room. He picked up the photograph from the mantel. You stood in front of a knife in a parking lot to keep a job so you could buy your boy medication, he said. You drove to Delano at 6 in the morning without an appointment and stood in line and asked for what you needed and drove home with an appointment card in your pocket and kept packing your boxes. He looked at her steadily. You did not wait for anybody to come save you. He set the photograph back down. Sophie did not have a mother like you, he said, but Danny does. The silence that followed had weight and dimension. Cassie stood inside it with the envelope in her hands and the handwritten note and the photograph on the mantel and the 2 suitcases by the door and the guy with the backpack standing 6 feet away. She felt the wall come down, not the slow brick by brick way she had felt it coming all week. All at once, one full section, like something that had been holding against pressure for a long time and finally made the calculation that the pressure was not going to stop. She stepped forward and put her good arm around Dax Boone and pressed her face against the leather of his cut. He stood still for a moment, the stillness of a man not accustomed to this and deciding what to do with it. Then his hand came up large and slow and careful and rested on her back. He did not move after that. From across the room, Danny watched. He watched for 3 seconds. Then he walked across the empty apartment and stopped in front of Dax and wrapped both arms around the man's leg and pressed the side of his face against it, his eyes closed. Dax looked down at the boy. Danny did not say anything for a moment. Then he tilted his face up. She was loved, wasn't she, Danny said. Sophie. He was not asking whether she had survived. He was asking the more important thing, the thing he had been working out since the night in the diner when he had seen the photograph and the tattoo and the way a large man's thumb moved across the edge of an old picture. Dax looked at him for a long time. He crouched down so that the geometry of height was no longer between them. He put his hand on top of Danny's head, flat and gentle, the scarred palm covering the crown of the boy's skull, the way you cup something you do not want to break. Very much, Dax said. Every single day. Danny nodded once slowly as if this were the answer he had needed to complete a calculation he had been working on for some time. He did not let go of Dax's leg. On the mantel, the photograph of a 30-year-old man holding his daughter in a pink blanket stood in the bare apartment with the morning light on it. Outside the window, 30 engines idled in the lot below, patient and steady, a sound like a great held breath waiting to release. Cassie looked at the appointment card in her coat pocket, the one from Delano, the one she had gotten herself. Then she looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Dax. She reached into her coat and set the appointment card on the mantel beside the photograph. You already made the appointment, Dax said. He was looking at the card. Before you came, she said. Yes. He picked up the appointment card. He looked at it. He folded it once along the existing crease and put it in the inside pocket of his cut, setting it in beside Sophie's photograph with the same deliberate care with which he set everything into that pocket. Then we go to Delano first, he said. Los Angeles can wait 1 week. He stood up. He picked up the nearest suitcase. He looked at Danny. You ready? He said. Danny Harmon, 6 years old with his backpack on his back and his dinosaur blanket under his arm, looked up at the largest human being he had ever stood close to in his life. He reached up and took Dax's free hand. Ready, he said. The townhouse on Redwood Court had a front porch. It was not a large porch, 6 feet deep, running the width of the front of the house with 2 steps up from the sidewalk and a railing that needed painting but was solid when you put your hand on it. There was a light fixture above the door that worked. There was a welcome mat that had come with the place. Cassie stood on that porch the first morning and looked at the street. The neighborhood did its living quietly. Ranch houses with maintained lawns, a sidewalk that ran the full length of the block. 3 houses down, a woman walked a deck in the early gray light and nodded when she passed the way. People nod in places where nodding is still the custom. Danny came to the door behind her. He had his socks on and his dinosaur blanket around his shoulders. He looked at the street. He looked at the porch railing. He gripped it with both hands and tested it methodically without drama. It holds, he said. It does, Cassie said. He went back inside to finish his cereal. She stayed on the porch a moment longer. Danny's room had a window facing the backyard where a single oak tree stood near the fence, bare now but structured in a way that promised something in spring. When they brought his things in on that first Saturday afternoon, he had walked to the center of the room and turned a slow circle, looking at each wall, the way a person orients themselves in a new space when they intend to stay in it. He had asked if he could put a nail in the wall. She had said yes. He had put up his drawing of her. The one that said, "This is my mom. She is not scared." It was the first thing on any wall in the new house. The weeks that followed had their own texture. The Wednesday appointment in Delano brought Dr. Abrams, a small, precise woman in her 50s, who spent 45 minutes with Danny and another 20 with Cassie, going through his history and his current medication regimen and what a proper long-term treatment plan would look like. She used the words suboptimal management not as a criticism, but as a clinical description of what a child with Danny's condition had been living with, and somehow that made it worse and better at the same time. She prescribed 2 medications. She set a follow-up for 6 weeks. On the drive home, Danny fell asleep in the back seat before they reached Highway 99. Cassie drove north through the flat brown fields with her son asleep behind her and the prescription bag on the passenger seat and the heater working correctly because the Civic had been looked at by a mechanic named Curtis that Dax had sent to the new house on Sunday morning. Curtis worked on the car for 2 hours, charged nothing, and left a handwritten note on the windshield listing the 3 things he had fixed. She had kept the note. She kept most things now. Appointment cards and handwritten notes and the small, accumulated evidence that the present was different from what the past had been. She kept them in a small box on the kitchen counter. Dax came to the house on Thursday evenings mostly. He did not announce it. He arrived around 6, sometimes with food from a barbecue place he favored on the south side, sometimes without. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked in his measured way about practical things. Whether the heat was working, whether she had found leads on a job, what Danny's breathing had been like through the week. He did not overstay. He was in the house between 45 minutes and an hour and a half, never there when Danny went to bed. There was a careful geometry to his presence, a deliberate attention to the shape and size of it, the way a person is careful not to fill a space that is not theirs to fill. Danny watched him the way he watched everything, with the full, unself-conscious attention of a child who has not yet learned that watching closely is considered impolite. He asked Dax questions when he had them, directly and without preamble. About the motorcycle, about the scar on his left cheekbone, about whether he had ever seen a great horned owl in the wild. Dax answered everything in the same level way, with the patient attention of someone who does not consider a child's question a lesser category of question. They talked about birds once for 40 minutes. The Falcon book had led Danny down a particular corridor of interest, and he had arrived at a specific fascination with great horned owls, their hunting range, the mechanics of their silent flight, the way the leading edge of their wing feathers was serrated at a microscopic level to break up turbulent air. Dax had listened to all of this and then said that he had once, a long time ago, found a great horned owl in a drainage ditch outside Bakersfield with a damaged wing. Danny had gone very still. "What happened to it?" he said. "I kept it in my garage for 6 weeks while the wing healed," Dax said. "Fed it mice I bought at a pet supply shop. Then I let it go," Dax said. "What if it had not come back?" Danny said. Dax had considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Then it would have been somewhere else," he said. "But either way, it would have been flying." Danny had thought about this for a while. After that, he started drawing owls. He drew one and left it on the kitchen table one Thursday evening after Dax had gone. Cassie found it in the morning, a careful pencil sketch of a great horned owl in flight, wings fully extended, the feather detail on the leading edge drawn in with precision remarkable for a 6-year-old's hand. At the bottom, he had written one word: free. She put it in the box on the counter. The job came through in the 3rd week. It was a position as a shift supervisor at a food distribution center on the north side of town. The work was physical and the hours were early, and the pay was better than the diner by $4 an hour, with benefits that included health insurance covering dependents. She had applied for it on the 2nd Monday in the new house. She had driven to the facility and asked to speak to a hiring manager and been interviewed on the spot by a woman named Sandra, who was direct about what the job required. Sandra had looked at Cassie's work history without comment and asked if she had any issue with early mornings. Cassie said she had been waking before dawn for years. Sandra said start Monday. She told Dax on Thursday. He said good. He said it the way he said most things, without elaboration. But she had come to understand his registers by then, and good said in that particular way meant something more than the word. She asked him once on a Thursday in December, when Danny was in his room and the kitchen was quiet, how he had known to come that Saturday morning. She meant how he had known the scope of it, the eviction, the boxes, the exact hour. He was quiet for a moment. "Willis Shepard," he said. "She called a number I left with her." "You left her a number," Cassie said. He drank his coffee. "In case," he said. She thought about that. The words "in case" containing inside them the entire architecture of what he had done, the week of watching and listening and preparing for a morning he was not certain would come, but had made himself ready for anyway. After a while, he said, "I was not going to let the math win." "The math," she said. "The calculation," he said. "The one you do at 3 in the morning when the numbers do not work and you decide not to call the ambulance because of what comes after." He looked at his hands on the table. "Sophie died because of that calculation. Her mother and I were young and the numbers were real, and we made the calculation that most people in that situation make." He paused. It was always going to be the wrong calculation. She reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment. He looked at her hand. He did not move. After a moment, she took her hand back and stood up and refilled his coffee cup without being asked. He stayed an extra 20 minutes that Thursday. The 6-week follow-up with Dr. Abrams came in mid-December. She drove Danny south on 99 in the early morning, and they listened to a nature program on the radio that Danny had discovered, occasionally updating Cassie on particularly significant facts in the tone of someone transferring information they considered important. Did you know that peregrine falcons dive at over 200 miles an hour, he said. I did not know that, she said. They have special structures in their nostrils to manage the air pressure, he said, so they do not suffocate from the speed. Smart birds, she said. Extremely, Danny said. Dr. Abrams weighed him and measured him and listened to his lungs for a long time with the stethoscope moving it across his back with careful precision while Danny sat patient and still on the examination table. She looked at Cassie. His airway reactivity has improved measurably from the baseline we established, she said. The inflammation markers are down. He is responding well. On the drive back north, Danny was in a processing quiet, the kind he went into when he was working something through. Mom, he said. Yes. Is the doctor going to keep making me better? That is the plan, she said. He thought about this. I think Dax needed to help us, he said. Not just because he wanted to. He said it with the directness of someone reporting an observation tested from multiple angles. She watched the road. What do you mean, she said. I think he was sad for a long time, Danny said. I think helping us made some of the sad smaller. She was quiet for a moment. I think you might be right, she said. Danny nodded once satisfied. He went back to looking out the window at the fields. On a Thursday in December, Dax arrived at 6 with the barbecue, and they ate at the kitchen table. Danny told him about the peregrines and their nasal structures, and Dax listened and asked the right questions. And Danny corrected him once on a point of aerodynamic anatomy, and Dax accepted the correction without comment. After dinner, Danny went to his room. He came back 5 minutes later carrying two things. The first was the owl drawing, the careful pencil sketch with the word free written at the bottom, the one he had left on the kitchen table weeks ago. He set it on the table in front of Dax. Then he went to the hallway and came back with the second thing. Cassie had made a copy of the photograph at the copy shop on Oak Street 2 weeks after they moved in the same shop where she had printed Gusha applications. She had put it in a small frame from the discount store, the plain kind, with a brass-colored edge. She had kept it in her coat pocket, carrying it through the days, waiting for the right moment to understand what to do with it. Danny set the framed photograph on the table beside the owl drawing, Sophie in the pink blanket, and the owl wings fully extended, the word free beneath it. 2 pictures on a kitchen table in a house on Redwood Court in November. Dax looked at both of them for a long time without speaking. Danny sat down in the chair beside him. He looked at the photograph and then at the drawing and then at Dax. She would have liked the owl, Danny said. I think she would have wanted to know everything about it, how it flies without making sound, how it sees in the dark. Dax looked at the photograph of his daughter. She would have, he said. She collected things she wanted to understand. She would have filled notebooks. She sounds like me, Danny said. Dax looked at him. She was louder, he said. From the day she was born, she was loud. She had opinions about everything, and she expressed all of them immediately. Danny considered this. I am working on being louder, he said. Dax looked at him for a moment. And then for the first time in the entirety of the months that Cassie had known him, across every Thursday evening, in every quiet kitchen conversation, in every careful measured presence in this house, Dax Boone smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not performed. It was the kind that arrives without permission, a small private thing that surfaces when something inside a person changes its position after a long time of being fixed. Danny saw it. Good, Dax said. His voice was different. Something in it that had been held taut for a long time had come down a degree. Danny reached over and picked up the framed photograph. He looked at it closely at the young man and the baby in the pink blanket. She was very loved, he said. I can tell from how you hold the picture. He set it back down on the table carefully between the owl drawing and his own hands. Dax sat with both things in front of him, the photograph and the drawing, and did not speak for a while, and the kitchen held the silence the way a good room holds the things that happen in it. 6 months later, on a Thursday morning in June, Cassie sat in a corridor of the pediatric pulmonary department at Valley Children's in Fresno and read a book while she waited. She was actually reading it. She had gotten through 30 pages. That would not have been possible a year ago. When Danny came out with the nurse, his backpack was on and his expression was composed and alert. He walked to her and sat down beside her and said they had him breathe into a machine 4 times, and each time he did better than the time before. Dr. Abrams came out 5 minutes later and said the words clearly and without ceremony. Normal range, Pulmonary function in the normal range for his age group. Continue current regimen. Annual follow-ups going forward. Cassie sat with that word. Normal. Not exceptional. Not a miracle. Just normal, the right size for what it meant, which was everything. She shook Dr. Abrams' hand. She helped Danny into the back seat in the parking structure and stood for a moment with her hand on the roof of the car. She looked at the concrete ceiling, the fluorescent lights, the oil stains on the floor, the ordinary, unremarkable structure of a place where ordinary, unremarkable good news had just been delivered. She got in and drove north on 99. She called Dax at the junction of 99 and 58. He picked up on the second ring. Normal range, she said. That is what the doctor said. There was a pause on the line. Yeah, he said. She said thank you for all of it. He was quiet for a moment. You drove to Delano at 6 in the morning, he said. You stood in that line. She looked at the road ahead, straight and long and north. We both did, she said. He did not argue with that. In the backseat, Danny said, Mom, there is a red-tailed hawk on that fence post. She looked. She saw it. Large and still on the post at the edge of the field, its chest toward the road, its head turned slightly away, watching something in the grass beyond the fence, with the absolute focused patience of something that has all the time it needs and knows exactly what it is waiting for. Tell Dax, she said. Danny leaned forward. There is a red-tailed hawk, he said into the phone on a fence post on Highway 99. Its hunting posture is very good. There was a pause. Then Dax said, I will watch for it. She put the phone down and drove her son home through the wide, flat fields under the June sky. That evening, the panhead was in the driveway on Redwood Court when they pulled in. Dax was on the porch steps with a paper bag from the barbecue place. He stood when the car pulled up. Danny got out before Cassie had fully stopped and crossed the small yard and stopped 2 feet short of Dax, as if remembering himself. Dax looked down at him. Normal range, Danny said. Normal range, Dax said. Danny nodded. Then he went up the steps and into the house. Dax watched the door close behind him. Then he looked at Cassie. She stood at the edge of the porch steps and looked back at him. The evening light on Redwood Court was the particular gold of California June, the kind that makes ordinary streets look like something worth keeping. The oak tree in the backyard was fully leafed, now green and full, its branches moving easily in the small wind that came across the neighborhood. At that hour, the way things move when they have grown strong enough to give without breaking. She took the steps. She took the paper bag. They went inside. Through the kitchen window, the oak tree moved in the evening light, and the little street outside went about its quiet life, and the panhead sat in the driveway with the last of the sun on its tank, and in the house on Redwood Court, the table was set for 3.